The real Game of Thrones, rise and fall of the Romanovs. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia stood suspended between two worlds, half medieval, half modern. It was a land of glittering palaces and starving villages, of French-speaking nobles and illiterate peasants. And at its summit sat one man, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, a ruler believed to be chosen by God, yet trapped by history itself. Nicholas was born into magnificence. The gilded halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg shimmered with chandeliers and gold leaf. Armies of servants moved like clockwork beneath painted ceilings. From childhood, he was taught that autocracy, the absolute authority of the Tsar, was not merely a system but a sacred duty. His father, Alexander III, was a giant of a man who ruled with iron certainty and feared liberalism as a disease. Nicholas inherited his throne but not his father's strength. Behind his calm eyes lay a quiet, hesitant soul, a man more comfortable with family life than politics, more suited to diaries than decrees. When Alexander III died in 1894, the 26-year-old Nicholas ascended the throne unprepared. His first official words to his advisors revealed both devotion and insecurity. "I am not ready to be Tsar." Yet readiness was irrelevant. Destiny had already chosen him. The coronation that followed was dazzling, a spectacle meant to project divine continuity. But beneath the golden crowns, a shadow stirred. That shadow revealed itself almost immediately during the coronation festivities at Moscow's Kodinka Field. A massive crowd of peasants gathered to receive free gifts and food. Poorly organized and uncontrolled, the celebration turned to catastrophe when rumors spread that supplies were running out. The crowd surged. Over 1,000 people were crushed to death. Instead of mourning publicly, Nicholas attended a gala ball that same evening. The tragedy marked his reign's beginning with a grim omen: an emperor detached from his people, insulated by ritual and council. Nicholas's marriage to Alexandra Fyodorovna, a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria, added to the tension. Devoted and deeply religious, Alexandra viewed monarchy as a divine mission. But she was shy, reserved, and mistrusted by the Russian nobility, who whispered that she was too foreign, too aloof. The birth of their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, was celebrated yet tinged with disappointment. The empire longed for a male heir. In 1904, Alexandra finally gave birth to a son, Alexei, but joy quickly turned to dread. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a rare blood disorder that could turn the smallest injury fatal. His illness would become the family's deepest secret and their ultimate vulnerability. Desperation led Alexandra to mysticism. Doctors offered no cure, so she turned to faith healers and spiritualists. Among them emerged a mysterious Siberian monk, Grigory Rasputin. Rough, charismatic, and rumored to possess healing powers, Rasputin seemed able to ease Alexei's pain through prayer and hypnosis. To the empress, he was a miracle. To the court, a scandal. Stories of his drunkenness and immorality spread through St. Petersburg's salons like wildfire. Yet Alexandra defended him fiercely, believing that God had sent him to save her son. Rasputin's influence over the royal family would become one of the most corrosive forces in the collapsing empire. While the palace sank into superstition, Russia itself groaned under inequality. By 1900, the empire held more than 130 million people, most of them peasants bound by poverty. Industrialization had begun, but without reform. Factories were crowded, wages low, and unrest spreading. In 1905, when peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar for better conditions, soldiers fired upon them. Hundreds died. The massacre, later known as Bloody Sunday, shattered the myth of the benevolent Tsar. Across the nation, strikes erupted, mutinies spread, and revolution flickered for the first time. Forced by crisis, Nicholas issued the October Manifesto, promising civil rights and creating a parliament, the Duma. But his concessions were hollow. As soon as the immediate danger passed, he curtailed its powers and returned to autocratic rule. The illusion of reform vanished, replaced by suspicion. From then on, the Tsar ruled a country that no longer trusted him. In the years that followed, Russia tried to modernize under impossible contradictions. Railroads stretched across Siberia, cities grew, yet backwardness persisted. The empire remained a powder keg of ethnic tensions, economic disparity, and political extremism. The revolutionary parties, Social Democrats, Bolsheviks, and others went underground, waiting for their moment. Then came war. In 1904, Russia challenged Japan for control of Manchuria and Korea conflict. It expected to win easily. Instead, the Russo-Japanese War ended in humiliating defeat. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire. The loss crippled Russian prestige and intensified public rage. Nicholas, once seen as God's chosen ruler, now looked disastrously incompetent, as if fate wished to test him further. World War I erupted in 1914. Nicholas believed war would unite his people under the banner of patriotism. At first it did, but the illusion soon collapsed. Russia's military was ill-equipped, its leadership outdated, and its industry unable to sustain the front. Millions of soldiers died or deserted. The Tsar's decision to personally command the army from the front line left the government in Alexander's hands and, by extension, Rasputin's. Rumors of treason and madness filled the streets of Petrograd. Bread shortages turned to riots. Faith in the monarchy disintegrated. By 1916, Rasputin's grip on the court had become intolerable. A group of nobles, fearing he would destroy the dynasty entirely, lured him to a midnight feast and assassinated him. His death, however, came too late to save the throne. The empire was collapsing faster than anyone could control. Early 1917 brought the breaking point. Strikes in Petrograd turned into revolution. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Railway lines were seized. The government paralyzed. Facing chaos, Nicholas abdicated the throne in March 1917, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. As his train carried him away from power, he wrote in his diary with tragic calm, "All around me, treachery, cowardice, and deceit." The family was placed under arrest first in the Alexander Palace, later transferred to Tobolsk, and finally to Yekaterinburg. There they lived under increasing guard, stripped of titles and possessions. Nicholas tended a small garden. Alexandra read the Bible aloud. The children sewed and wrote letters that would never reach their friends. The empire they once ruled had vanished, replaced by revolution and civil war. In the dim light of that basement where their lives would end, one truth became clear. The Romanovs were not merely victims of circumstance, but of history itself. The world had changed, and they could not change with it. Nicholas, too gentle, stubborn, devout, had inherited absolute power at the very moment when absolute power was dying. He believed that to yield authority was to betray God. But in the end, it was his faith in divine order that sealed his family's fate. The age of emperors was over. The modern world, born in factories and trenches, demanded a new kind of ruler, one who spoke the language of ideology, not divinity. Nicholas II stood at that crossroads and could not move. His reign began with a coronation bathed in gold and ended with a firing squad echoing through the Urals, yet his story endures not because of his triumphs but because of his tragedy. The last autocrat of Russia became a timeless warning that power without understanding and faith without empathy lead not to glory but to ruin. The election of Michael Romanov in 1613 ended one of the darkest periods in Russian history, but it did not erase the scars of the time of troubles. What Michael inherited was a fractured nation, exhausted by famine, rebellion, and foreign invasion. To rebuild Russia and secure the Romanovs' fragile new throne, the first rulers of the dynasty would need to navigate diplomacy, religion, war, and the ambitions of the nobility. This was the beginning of a long process, transforming the Romanovs from compromised candidates into unquestioned rulers of a vast empire. The struggles of Michael's reign. Michael Romanov was only 16 when he became Tsar. His youth meant that much of the early government was guided by his mother and a council of boyars, noblemen who wielded significant influence. Though this limited Michael's personal authority, it gave the dynasty breathing space to grow. His reign was defined by recovery and survival. Diplomacy. In 1617, the Treaty of Stolbovo ended the war with Sweden, forcing Russia to give up access to the Baltic Sea. 2 years later, the Treaty of Delino ended the conflict with Poland, though it left Smolensk and other western territories in Polish hands. These treaties were humiliating, but they brought stability. Domestic order. Michael worked to restore agriculture after the famines. He also granted lands to loyal nobles, ensuring their continued support. The Church, his father, Filaret, was eventually released from Polish captivity in 1619 and became Patriarch of Moscow. In practice, Filaret ruled alongside his son, strengthening the bond between throne and altar. Despite weak beginnings, Michael's reign laid the foundation for Romanov authority. When he died in 1645, the dynasty was stronger than at its birth, though still fragile. Alexis I, the pious Tsar Michael's son, Alexis I, 1645 to 1676, became the second Romanov Tsar. At 16, like his father, Alexis was young and inexperienced, but he grew into one of the most influential rulers of early Romanov Russia. Alexis was deeply religious, earning the nickname the Pious. His reign was marked by a fusion of spiritual zeal and political ambition. He expanded Russian influence, introduced reforms, and confronted internal unrest. Church reforms, and the Old Believers. One of the most consequential events of Alexis' reign was the reform of the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Nikon, a close advisor, sought to align Russian practices more closely with those of the Greek Orthodox Church. This led to changes in rituals, such as how people crossed themselves and how prayers were written. To outsiders, these seemed like small adjustments. But in a society where religion shaped identity, they were earth. Thousands of Russians rejected the reforms, clinging to the old ways. These dissenters became known as the Old Believers. The state branded them heretics, leading to brutal persecution. Many were executed or forced into exile. The schism permanently divided Russian society and highlighted how fragile the Romanovs' authority still was. Expansion and diplomacy. Alexis also expanded Russian territory. In 1654, Russia entered a war with Poland, reclaiming Smolensk and gaining much of Ukraine through the Treaty of Pereyaslav. This expansion was a turning point. Russia was emerging not just as a recovering state, but as a regional power. However, these wars were costly. Taxes rose, sparking unrest among peasants and urban dwellers. The uprising of 1648. Shortly after Alexis took power, a tax revolt known as the Salt Riot erupted in Moscow. Angry crowds stormed the Kremlin, forcing Alexis to dismiss corrupt officials. This uprising was just one of many during his reign, as peasants, serfs, and Cossacks resisted growing centralization. The most famous was the Cossack rebellion of Strenka raised in 1672-1671. Razin, the charismatic leader, rallied peasants and Cossacks against the nobility and the state. His movement captured large parts of southern Russia before being crushed. Razin was executed in Moscow, but his rebellion showed the deep social tensions that would plague Russia for centuries. Serfdom and the Romanov state. Perhaps the most lasting development of the early Romanov period was the codification of serfdom. By the mid-17th century, Russia's rulers faced a dilemma. They needed to stabilize agriculture and ensure a reliable labor force for nobles and the state. The solution was to legally bind peasants to the land. In 1649, Alexis's government issued the Subnorye Lozianai, a comprehensive legal code. Among its provisions was the permanent binding of peasants to their landlords, effectively cementing serfdom as the backbone of Russian society. This system guaranteed the loyalty of nobles, who now had near-total control over their serfs. But it also entrenched inequality and sowed the seeds of future unrest. Succession and struggles. After Alexis. When Alexis died in 1676, he left behind a complicated legacy, an expanded state, a divided church, and a society stratified by serfdom. His successors inherited both the benefits and the burdens of his reign. His son Fyodor III ruled briefly 1676 to 1682. Sickly and weak, Fyodor introduced some reforms but died young. The throne then passed into crisis once again. Fyodor's brothers, Ivan V, physically and mentally weakened, Peter I, later Peter the Great, became joint Tsars under the regency of their half-sister Sophia Alexeyevna. This power struggle between Sophia and the young Peter would shape the next era of Romanov history. Legacy of the early Romanovs from Michael I to Alexis I. The Romanovs transformed Russia from a nation in ruins into a centralized, expanding state. They restored stability after the time of troubles. They strengthened ties between church and state, though at the cost of religious unity. They expanded territory, laying the groundwork for future imperial ambitions. And, through the legalization of serfdom, they tied millions of peasants to the land, ensuring noble loyalty while deepening social divisions. The early Romanovs were not yet the autocrats of later centuries. Their rule was fragile, contested, and constantly challenged by both foreign enemies and domestic revolts. But they survived. On survival was enough to set the stage for greatness. The dynasty was only beginning to play the Game of Thrones. The next generation, led by Peter the Great, would transform Russia forever. When Fyodor III died in 1682, the Romanovs once again faced a crisis of succession. His half-brothers, Ivan V and Peter I, were named co-Tsars, but Ivan was weak in both body and mind, and Peter was only 10 years old. Real power fell into the hands of their ambitious half-sister Sophia Alexeyevna, who acted as regent. Sophia was intelligent, cunning, and ruthless, a true player in the Russian Game of Thrones. The regency of Sophia's rule was secured through intrigue and blood. With the support of the elite Streltsy regiments, the traditional musketeer corps of Moscow, seized control of the Kremlin. Her regency saw careful diplomacy, but also paranoia. When rumors spread in 1682 that Peter's family had murdered Ivan, the Streltsy rioted. They stormed the Kremlin, killing members of Peter's household before his very eyes. This traumatic moment shaped the boy who would one day be known as Peter the Great. Peter and his mother were eventually pushed out of Moscow to a village outside the city. There, young Peter immersed himself in military games, drilling groups of boys into mock regiments that would later become the seeds of a modern army. The rise of Peter in 1689, at just 17, Peter struck back, rallying loyal troops. He forced Sofia into a convent and claimed power for himself, though Ivan V remained co-Tsar until his death in 1696. Now Peter ruled alone, and from the very start he was unlike any Tsar before him. Peter stood over 6.5 feet tall, a towering figure in an age when most men were far shorter. Energetic, curious, and often volatile, he possessed a restless drive to transform Russia, the Western vision. Peter saw Russia as backward compared to the powers of Europe, while France, England, and the Dutch Republic were modernizing. Russia remained a medieval state of wooden cities, bearded nobles, and bound peasants. Determined to drag his nation into the modern age, Peter set out on a mission of transformation. In 1697, he embarked on the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic tour across Europe disguised as a simple servant. The army and navy. Peter built a standing army trained on European lines and created Russia's first real navy from scratch. He forced nobles to serve in either the military or civil administration, binding their fates to the state. The beard tax, seeking to modernize appearances. Peter ordered nobles and commoners alike to shave their traditional beards. His first attempt capturing the Black Sea fortress of Azov from the Ottomans had limited success. His true test came against Sweden, then a dominant military power in Northern Europe. The Great Northern War began in 1700. Early defeats humbled Peter, but he learned quickly. Over 2 decades, he transformed Russia's armies into a disciplined modern force. The turning point came at the Battle of Poltava, 1709. Founded in 1703, St. Petersburg was a city carved out of swamps by forced labor. Tens of thousands of peasants died during its construction, earning it the nickname the city built on bones. But for Peter, St. Petersburg symbolized his vision, a window to the West, a city of stone and grandeur that would replace old Moscow as the heart of Russia. By moving the capital there in 1712, Peter broke with tradition and firmly oriented Russia toward Europe. Autocracy and terror. Peter's reforms were dramatic, but they came at a terrible human cost. His demands for labor and taxes crushed the peasantry, while his attacks on tradition enraged conservative nobles and clergy even within his family. Peter's rule bred tragedy. His eldest son Alexei opposed his reforms and secretly conspired with reactionary nobles. When his betrayal was uncovered, Peter had him arrested, tortured, and condemned to death. Alexei died in prison in 1718, possibly executed under his father's orders. This ruthless act showed the lengths Peter would go to secure his vision. For him, Russia's modernization was worth any sacrifice of his own son. The death of Peter the Great. By the early 1720s, Peter had achieved much of what he set out to do. But his reforms also deepened divisions. Serfdom remained intact, feeding social unrest. His brutality alienated much of the population, and by failing to secure a smooth succession, he set the stage for decades of instability. The Romanovs had entered the world stage as rulers of a true empire, but the struggle for power within the dynasty was far from over. The year was 1917. Russia stood at the edge of a precipice, and few in the palaces of St. Petersburg realized just how far the empire had already slipped. The world outside the gilded gates of the Winter Palace looked nothing like the grandeur within. Russia's peasants, still the backbone of the empire, lived in misery, burdened with crushing poverty, heavy taxes, and the wounds of a war that seemed endless. The First World War had drained Russia of food, men, and morale. Villages were emptying as millions were drafted into a conflict they barely understood, only to return, if they returned at all, maimed, starving, or broken. Inside the palace, Nicholas II clung to the belief that autocracy could survive unchanged. He was no tyrant in the traditional sense. By many accounts he was gentle, even kindly in private life, but he was disastrously out of touch. He believed God had chosen him to rule, and that compromise with the people was weakness. In an age when monarchs across Europe were bending to constitutional systems, Nicholas clung stubbornly to absolute power. But it was not only war and politics that rotted the foundation of the Romanov throne. Inside the royal family's circle, suspicion and scandal flourished. At the center of it stood a figure as magnetic as he was infamous: Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant turned mystic who had won the favor of the Tsarina Alexandra. Her son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, suffered from hemophilia disease that left him vulnerable to even the smallest injury. Time and again, when Alexei's health failed, Rasputin appeared to restore him. Whether it was hypnosis, prayer, or sheer coincidence, Alexandra was convinced he was divinely sent to protect her child. But Rasputin's presence at court came at a terrible price. The nobility despised him, accusing him of debauchery, corruption, and manipulating the Tsarina. Rumors spread like wildfire that Rasputin and Alexandra were lovers, that he secretly dictated state policy, that Russia was being run not by the Tsar but by a mad monk and a foreign-born empress. To the Russian people, who were starving in the streets, the scandal seemed like proof that the monarchy was hopelessly corrupt. Soldiers at the front whispered about bread riots at home. Factory workers in Petrograd, the new name of St. Petersburg, struck against unbearable conditions. In February 1917, the spark finally ignited. Bread shortages led to mass protests in the capital. Women took to the streets demanding food for their children. Workers followed, striking in solidarity. Within days, demonstrations swelled into hundreds of thousands. Soldiers sent to suppress the unrest refused to fire on the crowds. Many even joined them, carrying their rifles over to the side of the people. The army, the very backbone of Nicholas's rule, was collapsing in loyalty. Nicholas, blind to the scale of the crisis, ordered harsh measures, but by the time he realized the gravity of the uprising, it was too late. The Duma, Russia's parliament, seized the moment. Though Nicholas had always resisted them, they now declared a provisional government. Trains carrying Nicholas back to the capital were blocked. He was effectively cut off from his throne. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II signed the Act of Abdication. More than 300 years of Romanov rule ended in that single stroke of the pen. The dynasty that had built Russia into an empire, that had overseen its golden palaces and bloody years, was gone. Nicholas at first considered naming his sickly son Alexei as heir, but fearing for the boy's survival, he passed the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. Michael, however, declined the crown. For the first time in centuries, Russia was without a Tsar. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest, first in their palace, then moved deeper into the interior as the provisional government struggled to maintain control. But the chaos of 1917 was far from over. The provisional government, led by moderates and liberals, promised reforms, but it failed to address the most urgent demands: peace, land, and bread. Russia remained in the war. Soldiers continued to die. Peasants seized land from nobles without waiting for permission. And over all of it loomed a more radical force: the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin returned to Russia that spring, smuggled through Germany in a sealed train. His message was simple, blunt, and electrifying: peace, land, and bread. Unlike the provisional government, Lenin promised immediate withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land, and power to the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers who now rivaled the government itself. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks struck with astonishing speed. They seized Petrograd. The Winter Palace, once the seat of Romanov splendor, was stormed, not by armies, but by determined revolutionaries. The provisional government collapsed with barely a fight. Lenin declared a new order, Soviet power. For the Romanovs, the Bolshevik takeover sealed their fate. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were moved to increasingly remote locations, Tobolsk, then Ekaterinburg. Guards watched their every move. The new Soviet regime debated what to do with them. Some wanted to put them on trial, others to exile them abroad. But as civil war erupted between the Red Army Bolsheviks and the White Army, their opponents, many of them loyal to the old regime, the Romanovs became too dangerous as symbols. By 1918, the Bolsheviks feared that advancing white forces might rescue the royal family and restore them to power. The decision was made in secrecy. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the Romanovs were woken and led to a basement in the House of Special Purpose in Ekaterinburg. Nicholas carried his ailing son, Alexei. Alexandra clutched a pillow stuffed with jewels sewn into it, hoping it would protect her child. They were told they were being moved for their safety. Then, a firing squad entered. What followed was chaos and brutality. Gunfire filled the room. Bullets ricocheted off jewels hidden in the family's clothing, forcing executioners to finish their grim task with bayonets and gunshots at close range. Within minutes, the last Romanovs were dead. Their bodies were burned, buried, and hidden. The dynasty was erased not only from the throne but from the earth itself. The fall of the Romanovs was more than the end of a family. It was the end of an era, of the final collapse of Russia's imperial age. For centuries, the Tsars had stood as symbols of absolute power. Their palaces glittered, their rule unchallenged. But in 1917 the people had risen, and in 1918 the dynasty was silenced forever. Yet even in death, the Romanovs never disappeared from memory. For monarchists, they became martyrs. For revolutionaries, they were the final proof that history had turned. And for Russia itself, they remain a wound, part tragedy, part cautionary tale. The revolution promised peace and justice, but it unleashed civil war, famine, and decades of authoritarian rule under a new order. The Romanovs were gone, but Russia's long struggle between power and people had only just begun. A new emperor, Alexander I, in 1801. After years of Catherine the Great's glittering reign, the Romanovs faced turmoil once again. Her son Paul I had become emperor after her death, but Paul's reign was short, erratic, and disastrous. Obsessed with military discipline and paranoid about conspiracies, he alienated nobles, officers, and even his own family. In March 1801, Paul was assassinated in his bedroom at the St. Michael's Castle in St. Petersburg. His son, Alexander I, ascended to the throne. Alexander was just 23 years old, a tall, handsome, and idealistic young man. He carried the weight of his grandmother Catherine's legacy, but also the trauma of his father's violent death. From the start, Alexander was a paradox. Outwardly liberal, inwardly autocratic. Russia and Napoleon, friends, rivals, enemies. The early 19th century was defined by the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who transformed France into a continental empire. Russia and Napoleon's France began as uneasy allies, then shifted into bitter enemies. At first, Alexander and Napoleon respected one another. After Napoleon crushed Austria and Prussia, he met Alexander at the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. The two emperors embraced on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, a symbolic gesture of peace. But beneath the smiles lay rivalry. Napoleon sought domination of Europe. Alexander wanted to preserve Russia's influence. The alliance collapsed when Napoleon launched his greatest gamble, the invasion of Russia. The 1812 invasion, Napoleon's fatal mistake. In June 1812, Napoleon led the Grande Army, more than 600,000 soldiers, into Russia. It was the largest military force Europe had ever seen. Napoleon expected a quick, decisive victory. Instead, he encountered a strategy of retreat and scorched earth. The Russians, under generals like Kutuzov, refused to give battle until the French were deep inside the country. Villages were burned, supplies destroyed, and Napoleon's army stretched thin. Finally, in September 1812, the French faced the Russians at the Battle of Borodino, just outside Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, over 70,000 dead or wounded in a single day. Napoleon technically won, but it was a hollow victory. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found the city deserted and in flames. Without supplies, winter closing in, and Russian forces harassing his retreat, the Grande Army collapsed. By December, fewer than 100,000 of Napoleon's men staggered back across the border. The invasion of Russia had destroyed Napoleon's empire, and Alexander I emerged as the savior of Europe. the Congress of Vienna and Russian glory after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Alexander took a leading role in reshaping Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, Russia gained vast territories, including most of Poland. Alexander was hailed as the liberator of Europe, but Alexander's triumph abroad did not solve Russia's problems at home. The war had introduced Russian officers to Western Europe, where they saw constitutional governments, freer societies, and modern economies. Returning home, these officers faced the grim reality of Russian autocracy and serfdom. The seeds of revolution were sown. The disillusionment of Alexander I, despite his early reputation as a liberal reformer. Alexander grew increasingly conservative after 1815. He strengthened censorship, empowered the secret police, and abandoned serious reform of serfdom. Haunted by guilt over his father's assassination and weary from years of war, Alexander retreated into mysticism and religion. By the 1820s, he was an isolated figure, increasingly detached from reality. In December 1825, Alexander I died unexpectedly while traveling in southern Russia. His sudden death sparked confusion over succession and an unprecedented challenge to Romanov rule. The Decembrist revolt won 8-5. With Alexander's death, his younger brother Nicholas I was proclaimed emperor. But Nicholas's rule began in blood. A group of liberal army officers, inspired by Enlightenment ideals and disillusioned by autocracy, saw Alexander's death as an opportunity. They gathered in Senate Square, St. Petersburg, with thousands of soldiers, demanding a constitution and reforms. This was the Decembrist revolt, the first open attempt to challenge Romanov autocracy. Nicholas acted swiftly. Loyal troops surrounded the rebels. Cannon fire blasted across the square, scattering the revolutionaries. The uprising was crushed in hours. Hundreds of officers were arrested. 5 leaders were executed by hanging. Others were exiled to Siberia, condemned to years of harsh labor in frozen mines. Though the revolt failed, it marked a turning point. For the first time, Russians had risen publicly against their Tsar in the name of freedom. Nicholas won. The Iron Tsar, the failed revolt, left Nicholas I shaken, but also determined. He ruled with an iron fist, earning the nickname the Iron Tsar. Nicholas strengthened censorship, expanded the secret police, the third section, and banned even whispers of reform. He saw himself as a soldier emperor obsessed with order and discipline. To the nobility, Nicholas was a stern guardian of tradition. To intellectuals and reformers, he was a tyrant. Yet Nicholas also modernized the military, expanded the empire, and presided over industrial beginnings in Russia. His reign set the stage for greater conflicts in the mid-19th century, conflicts that would test the strength of the Romanovs once again. Legacy of the Decembrists. The Decembrists were crushed, but their sacrifice lived on. They became martyrs for the cause of Russian liberty, inspiring later generations of revolutionaries. Writers like Alexander Herzen and poets like Pushkin celebrated their courage. In a way, the Decembrists were the first shadow of 1917, the revolution that would finally topple the Romanovs a century later. The Napoleonic Wars had given Russia glory and power on the world stage, but that same triumph exposed the fragility of the empire. Russian soldiers who marched to Paris returned with dreams of freedom, and those dreams clashed violently with Romanov autocracy. The Decembrist revolt was small and doomed, but it was a warning of things to come. From now on, the Romanovs faced not only threats from abroad, but from within their own empire. As Nicholas I tightened his grip, Russia seemed strong and unshakable. But beneath the surface, new forces were stirring, forces that no iron fist could crush forever. The iron grip of Nicholas. When Nicholas I took the throne in December 1825, it was under the shadow of rebellion. The Decembrist revolt, though small, had shaken the monarchy to its core. Nicholas, deeply scarred by this first brush with revolution, resolved that it would never happen again. From the very start, Nicholas ruled like a soldier. Tall, rigid, and intimidating, he embodied the image of a stern commander rather than a benevolent monarch. His philosophy was summed up in 3 words: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. Orthodoxy meant unwavering loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church. Autocracy meant absolute power of the Tsar. Nationality meant devotion to Russian culture, often at the expense of minorities. This ideological triad became the cornerstone of Nicholas's reign. But it also created a suffocating atmosphere. Censorship was severe. Secret police, the feared third section, watched over intellectuals, students, and even nobles. Any hint of dissent could lead to exile in Siberia. The paradox of progress and repression. Despite his obsession with control, Nicholas presided over a Russia that was slowly modernizing. The Industrial Revolution, sweeping across Europe, touched Russia as well. Railroads began to appear, factories multiplied, and St. Petersburg and Moscow grew into bustling centers of industry. But modernization was uneven and shallow. Russia remained overwhelmingly rural. Millions of peasants still lived as serfs bound to the land, legally tied to landlords, and denied basic freedoms. This contradiction defined Nicholas's Russia: progress in infrastructure, stagnation in society. While Western Europe liberalized, Russia clung to autocracy. This tension would haunt the Romanovs for the rest of their dynasty, foreign policy, and the quest for glory. Nicholas I viewed himself as the gendarme of Europe, the policeman of the continent. He believed it was Russia's duty to crush revolution wherever it appeared. In 1830, when Poland rose in revolt against Russian rule, Nicholas responded with brutal force. The Polish uprising was crushed, Warsaw fell, and Poland's constitution was abolished. In 1848, as revolutions erupted across Europe from Paris to Vienna to Berlin, Nicholas sent Russian troops to aid Austria in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution. For conservatives, Nicholas was a hero. For liberals, he was the executioner of freedom. But Nicholas's ambition reached its peak in the 1850s, when he sought to expand Russian influence in the declining Ottoman Empire. This would lead to the defining crisis of his reign, the Crimean War, the road to Crimea. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. Nicholas believed Russia had the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands and perhaps gain territory in the Balkans. But his ambitions alarmed other powers, especially Britain and France, who feared Russian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. When Nicholas's troops occupied Ottoman-controlled territories in 1853, war became inevitable. In October 1853, Russia and the Ottoman Empire clashed, but soon, Britain and France joined on the Ottoman side. For the first time in decades, Russia faced a coalition of modern European powers. The Crimean War 1853–1856. The war was fought largely on the Crimean Peninsula, in the Black Sea region. At first, Russians expected an easy victory, but the reality was devastating. The Allied forces of Britain, France, and the Ottomans were better equipped, better supplied, and technologically more advanced. They used modern rifles, steam-powered ships, and efficient logistics. Russia, by contrast, still relied on outdated muskets, wooden ships, and inefficient supply lines. The most famous battle was the Siege of Sevastopol 1854–1855. For nearly a year, Russian forces held out against relentless bombardment, but in September 1855, the fortress fell after immense casualties. The Crimean War was also remembered for its grim conditions. Disease killed more soldiers than battle. The war became a symbol of outdated medical practices until figures like Florence Nightingale revolutionized battlefield nursing. A national humiliation. By 1856, Russia was forced to sign the Treaty of Paris, marking a humiliating defeat. The Black Sea was demilitarized, and Russian ambitions in the Balkans were checked. The Crimean War exposed the rotten core of Nicholas's empire. The Russian army was brave but backward. The economy was vast but inefficient. And serfdom crippled the potential of the nation. For Nicholas, who was a personal disaster, the Iron Tsar, who had built his image on strength and order, died in 1855 before the war officially ended. Many believed he succumbed to despair, broken by the failure of his dreams. The seeds of change. The Crimean War was more than a military defeat. It was a wake-up call. Russian intellectuals, nobles, and even some officials began to realize that the empire could not survive without reform. The contrast was stark. While Britain and France marched into the modern industrial age, Russia remained shackled by medieval structures like serfdom. The war proved that repression alone could not preserve the empire. Nicholas's son, Alexander II, would inherit not only the throne, but the urgent task of reform. He would go on to attempt the most radical transformation of Russian society since Peter the Great. Nicholas I's reign was a paradox of grandeur and decay. He presented himself as the iron defender of autocracy, the unshakable pillar of tradition. Yet beneath the facade, Russia was falling behind, trapped in outdated systems and weighed down by the chains of serfdom. The Crimean War ripped away the illusion of strength and exposed the vulnerabilities of the Romanov Empire. Nicholas I left behind a legacy of repression, but also the undeniable need for change. As Alexander II stepped onto the throne, Russia stood at a crossroads. Would reform save the empire or merely delay its eventual collapse? The burden of inheritance. When Alexander II inherited the throne in 1855, he faced a shattered empire. His father Nicholas I had died during the humiliating Crimean War, leaving Russia battered and demoralized. The war had exposed the nation's weaknesses: outdated weapons, inefficient bureaucracy, and a stagnant economy dependent on serf labor. Russia stood at a crossroads. Reform was no longer optional, it was essential for survival. And Alexander, unlike his iron-willed father, was open to change. The Tsar Liberator Alexander II quickly earned the nickname the Tsar Liberator. His reign became synonymous with one of the most dramatic transformations in Russian history: the emancipation of the serfs. Serfdom had long been the backbone of Russia's agricultural system, but it was also a system of oppression, tying millions of peasants to landlords like property. It crippled productivity, stifled innovation, and fueled discontent. In 1861, after years of debate and resistance from the nobility, Alexander issued the Emancipation Manifesto. 22 million serfs were granted personal freedom. They could marry without permission, own property, and engage in trade. Alexander II didn't stop at freeing the serfs. His era became known for the Great Reforms, sweeping changes that aimed to modernize Russia. Judicial reforms. For centuries, Russian courts had been corrupt, arbitrary, and controlled by officials loyal to the Tsar. Alexander introduced independent courts with trial by jury, equal treatment before the law, at least in theory, more transparency in legal proceedings, military reforms. The Crimean War had exposed the incompetence of the Russian military. In response, Alexander reduced military service from 25 years to 6 years active duty plus reserve, introduced universal conscription, meaning not only peasants but nobles could be drafted, modernized training, equipment, and officer education. Educational reforms. Education expanded dramatically. Universities gained more autonomy, and literacy rates began to rise. A new generation of students more politically aware and eager for change emerged, which ironically would later fuel revolutionary movements. Local government reforms. In 1864, Alexander created local self-government councils called zemstvos. These councils, elected by nobles, townsmen, and peasants, handled schools, roads, and healthcare. While limited in power, they gave ordinary people a voice in local administration for the first time. The awakening of society. Alexander's reforms unleashed a wave of new energy in Russian society. Intellectuals, writers, and activists flourished. The press gained more freedom, and radical ideas began to spread. But this awakening was double-edged. While some celebrated Alexander's reforms, others demanded more. For peasants, emancipation had not solved poverty. For intellectuals, autocracy still loomed large. For radicals, only revolution could bring true freedom. A dangerous divide began to grow between reformers who wanted gradual change and revolutionaries who sought to overthrow the entire system. The shadow of repression. Despite his reforms, Alexander II was still a Romanov Sarand. He had no intention of surrendering absolute power. As radical movements grew, the state cracked down, censorship tightened, the secret police expanded, and arrests of dissidents became common. This tension created a tragic paradox. Alexander gave Russia more freedom than any Tsar before him, but that freedom also fueled opposition against him. The rise of revolutionary movements. By the 1870s, revolutionary groups like Narodan Volya, the People's Will, emerged. These radicals believed that only violence could end autocracy. They carried out assassinations of officials, organized underground cells, and plotted against the Tsar himself. At the same time, nationalist movements surged within the empire. Poles, Ukrainians, Finns, and other minorities demanded autonomy or independence. Russia's vast diversity, once a source of strength, became a source of unrest. Foreign policy and expansion. Alexander II's reign wasn't just about domestic reform. He also pursued expansion abroad. In the Caucasus, Russian forces crushed resistance and incorporated new territories. In Central Asia, Russia advanced steadily, clashing with Khanates and extending imperial influence. In North America, however, Russia gave up territory. In 1867, the empire sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, a move many Russians saw as short-sighted, though it relieved financial strain. The Tsar's tragic end. By the 1880s, Alexander II's reign stood on shaky ground. His reforms had changed Russia, but not enough to satisfy his people. To conservatives he was too liberal, to radicals he was too repressive. On March 13, 1881, fate caught up with him. As his carriage drove through St. Petersburg, members of Narodna Volia launched an assassination attempt. A bomb was thrown, injuring bystanders. When Alexander stepped out to check the damage, a second assassin hurled another bomb. The explosion tore through the Tsar's body. Within hours, Alexander II was dead. Ironically, he had been preparing to sign a decree for limited constitutional reform steps that might have transformed Russia into a constitutional monarchy. His death slammed the door on that possibility. Legacy of the Tsar liberator Alexander II remains one of the most complex Romanovs. His emancipation of the serfs reshaped Russian society, yet it also left millions dissatisfied. His reforms modernized the empire, but they also fueled new demands that autocracy could never meet. In many ways, Alexander II planted the seeds of both hope and destruction. His son, Alexander III, would respond to his assassination not with more reform, but with a fierce return to repression, setting the stage for the growing storm of revolution. The reign of Alexander II was a watershed in Romanov history. He tried to reconcile autocracy with modernization, tradition with reform. For a time it seemed Russia might find a new path, but in the end, the contradictions proved too great. His assassination was not just the end of a ruler, it was the death of a possibility. The dream of a constitutional monarchy in Russia died with him, leaving the empire trapped between reform and reaction. As the Romanov dynasty moved forward, the question remained: could the old autocracy adapt to a rapidly changing world, or would it collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? The weight of assassination. On March 13, 1881, the streets of St. Petersburg were stained with the blood of Alexander II, the Tsar liberator. His assassination by radical revolutionaries sent shockwaves throughout the empire. For his son, Alexander III, the message was clear: reform had brought weakness, and weakness had invited chaos. At just 36 years old, Alexander ascended the throne amidst grief and fear. His worldview hardened in that moment. Reform was dangerous. An autocracy was the only shield that could protect Russia from collapse. A new Tsar, a new direction. Where Alexander II had been soft-spoken and reform-minded, Alexander III was imposing, blunt, and deeply conservative. Standing over 6 feet tall with a massive frame and a thick beard, he looked every bit the autocrat. Unlike his father, he had no illusions about sharing power. His reign began with a vow: no more concessions to liberals, radicals, or minorities. Instead, he sought to strengthen the monarchy, the church, and Russian nationalism. The ideology of reaction. Alexander III's rule was guided by 3 principles, often referred to as orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Orthodoxy. The Russian Orthodox Church was to be the spiritual backbone of the empire. It promoted loyalty, obedience, and unity under the Tsar. Autocracy. The Tsar's power was absolute and unquestionable. Any hint of constitutional monarchy or democracy was rejected outright. Nationality. Russian culture and identity were elevated above all others in the empire, often at the expense of minority groups. This philosophy drove nearly every decision of his reign. Rolling back the reforms, Alexander III wasted little time in reversing the changes his father had introduced. Local government zemstvos, their powers were sharply restricted. Nobles were given greater control, while peasants had fewer opportunities to participate. Judiciary. The independence of courts was curtailed. Judges could be removed and trials of political suspects were shifted to military courts. Universities. Students faced strict surveillance. Political activism on campuses was crushed, and curriculum was tailored to enforce loyalty to the state. The small taste of freedom that Russia had experienced under Alexander II was swiftly rolled back. The iron fist of repression. The assassination of his father haunted Alexander III. Determined to prevent a repeat, he unleashed a wave of repression. Secret police, books, newspapers, and plays faced heavy censorship. Anything deemed dangerous to the autocracy was banned. Intellectual life was suffocated, forcing many writers and thinkers into exile. Russification. One of Alexander's most aggressive policies was Russification, a campaign to force non-Russian communities to adopt Russian language, culture, and religion. In Poland, the Polish language was banned in schools and administration. In Finland, autonomy was restricted. In the Baltic states, German institutions were suppressed. Jews faced particularly harsh persecution, including restrictions on residency, professions, and education. Anti-Semitic violence, or pogroms, erupted with tacit approval from authorities. Russification was intended to unify the empire, but it often bred resentment and resistance among minority populations. The peasants and the land question. The emancipation of the serfs had left millions in poverty, and Alexander III offered little relief. Instead, he imposed harsh agricultural taxes and maintained the unpopular redemption payments. The government even created the Peasant Land Bank, which was supposed to help peasants buy land, but in practice, it kept them dependent on the state and struggling under debt. While the nobility retained privileges, peasants bore the brunt of economic hardship, deepening the divide that would later fuel revolutionary fury. Industrial growth under a repressive hand. Ironically, while politically repressive, Alexander III presided over significant economic modernization. With the guidance of his finance minister Sergei Vita, Russia began to industrialize more aggressively. Railroads expanded, factories multiplied, and coal and steel production increased. The most symbolic project was the Trans-Siberian Railway, stretching thousands of miles to link Moscow with Vladivostok. This economic growth, however, came at a cost. Workers in urban centers endured long hours, unsafe conditions, and meager wages. Strikes were illegal, and protesters were brutally suppressed. The seeds of worker discontent later harvested by the Bolsheviks were quietly being planted. A family man, despite his harsh politics, Alexander III was known as a devoted family man. Unlike many Romanovs, he was faithful to his wife, Maria Feodorovna, formerly Princess Dagmar of Denmark. Together they raised a large family, instilling in their children a sense of duty and discipline. One of those children, Nicholas Alexandrovich, would eventually inherit the throne as Nicholas II. Under his father's shadow, Nicholas absorbed the lessons of autocracy, but also the isolation that came with it. Foreign policy, peace through strength. Unlike some of his predecessors, Alexander III was cautious in foreign affairs. Traumatized by the Crimean War and wary of unnecessary conflicts, he focused on maintaining peace. He strengthened Russia's alliance with France, laying the groundwork for the later Franco-Russian alliance. He avoided major wars, preferring to consolidate strength at home. His emphasis on a strong army and navy ensured Russia remained a formidable power, but his restraint kept the empire out of disastrous entanglements during his reign. In this sense, Alexander III was known as the Peacemaker Tsar, a title that contrasted sharply with the iron fist he used against his own people. The symbol of reaction, Alexander III's reign embodied reactionary politics. His efforts did temporarily stabilize the empire and suppress revolutionary activity. For many conservatives, he was the ideal Tsar, strong, uncompromising, and unapologetically Russian. Yet, beneath the surface, his policies created long-term problems. By silencing reform, he deepened frustrations among peasants, workers, and minorities. By enforcing Russification, he alienated vast portions of his population. And by clinging to autocracy, he denied Russia the chance to gradually transition into a constitutional monarchy. The Tsar's death and legacy. Alexander III's life ended abruptly in 1894 due to kidney disease. His death shocked the empire, as he had seemed invincible. His son, Nicholas II, just 26 years old, suddenly found himself on the throne, ill-prepared and burdened with the expectations of empire. Alexander III left behind a mixed legacy. He restored order after the chaos of his father's assassination. He strengthened Russia's economy and military, but he also left a society simmering with unresolved tensions that would explode under his son's reign. Alexander III's reign was a pause button on Russian reform. For 13 years, he tried to freeze history, to hold back the tide of change with brute force and reactionary policies. For a time, it worked. The empire seemed stable, the monarchy secure, but stability achieved through repression is fragile. By ignoring the cries of peasants, workers, and minorities, Alexander III merely postponed the inevitable. The storm was coming, and his son, Nicholas II, would face it head. An heir without preparation. When Alexander III died in 1894, his son Nicholas II became emperor at just 26 years old. Sensitive, soft-spoken, and deeply religious, Nicholas was not suited for the weight of autocracy. He himself admitted to a close friend, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to be one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Yet the crown was his. And with it came the burden of holding together a vast empire already strained by inequality, unrest, and modernization. A coronation stained by tragedy. Nicholas's coronation in 1896 set an ominous tone for his reign. During festivities at Kodinka Field in Moscow, a stampede broke out when rumors spread that gifts were being distributed. Over 1,300 people were trampled to death, and thousands more injured. Instead of mourning publicly, Nicholas continued with the celebrations, leaving many Russians disillusioned with their young Tsar. To them, he seemed cold, detached, and indifferent to suffering. A family man in a changing world. Privately, Nicholas adored his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, formerly Princess Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, Germany. Their marriage was one of genuine love, but also of isolation. Alexandra, shy and devout, had difficulty connecting with Russian society. Her foreign origins and strong influence over Nicholas made her unpopular at court. Together, they raised 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and 1 son, Alexei, whose birth in 1904 seemed like a blessing but soon revealed itself as a curse. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a deadly blood disorder. This secret would later draw the family into the orbit of the mysterious and controversial figure Grigory Rasputin. The struggles of a modernizing empire. Under Nicholas II, Russia continued to industrialize. Railways spread, factories grew, and cities swelled with peasants seeking work. But modernization came without social protections. Workers endured 12 to 14-hour days in unsafe conditions. Wages were meager, housing overcrowded, and strikes brutally suppressed. Peasants remained trapped in debt and poverty. The gap between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses widened dangerously. Revolutionary groups, Marxists, anarchists, and populists began to organize, promising change. The Russo-Japanese War 1904–1905. One of Nicholas's first major tests was foreign policy. Believing a victorious war would unite his people, he challenged Japan for control of Manchuria and Korea. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The Japanese army and navy were modern, disciplined, and well-prepared. Russia's forces were outdated, poorly supplied, and incompetently led. In 1905, the humiliating defeat at Tsushima Strait, where nearly the entire Russian Baltic fleet was destroyed, stunned the world. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a European empire. At home, the loss shattered Nicholas's credibility. Discontent boiled into open revolt. The 1905 revolution. On January 22, 1905, thousands of workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying icons and petitions for better conditions. They believed the little Father Tsar would hear their pleas. Instead, soldiers opened fire. Hundreds were killed in what became known as Bloody Sunday. This massacre ignited a wave of strikes, peasant uprisings, and mutinies across the empire. Nicholas was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and creating a parliament, the Duma. For the first time, Russia appeared to be moving toward constitutional monarchy, but the Tsar's promises were hollow. He soon restricted the Duma's powers, dissolved assemblies when they challenged him, and ruled with near-total authority. To his people, he was once again a betrayer, the shadow of Rasputin. Meanwhile, the royal family faced turmoil at home. Young Alexei's hemophilia left him constantly at risk of bleeding to death. Desperate for a cure, Alexandra turned to Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic and self-proclaimed holy man. To the astonishment of many, Rasputin seemed able to ease Alexei's suffering, possibly through hypnosis or simple calming influence. Alexandra became convinced he was sent by God, but Rasputin's presence at court was scandalous. His drinking, womanizing, and influence over government appointments outraged nobles and ministers alike. Rumors spread that he and Alexandra were lovers, tarnishing the monarchy's reputation. The more the public mocked Rasputin, the more Nicholas and Alexandra clung to him, deepening the sense that the Romanovs were out of touch, even corrupt. World War I, the final blow. In 1914, World War I erupted. Nicholas, loyal to Russia's alliance with Serbia, plunged the empire into a catastrophic conflict. At first, patriotic fervor swept the nation, but soon, the realities of war set in. Russian soldiers faced shortages of rifles, ammunition, and even boots. Millions were killed, wounded, or captured. The economy collapsed under the strain, leading to inflation and famine at home. In 1915, Nicholas made the disastrous decision to personally take command of the army. This left him directly responsible for Russia's defeats, while leaving Alexandra guided by Rasputin effectively in charge of the government in Petrograd. Corruption, mismanagement, and military disasters eroded what little support the monarchy had left. The February Revolution of 1917. By early 1917, Russia was on the brink. Food shortages sparked protests in Petrograd, strikes paralyzed factories, soldiers tired of war mutinied and joined the demonstrators. On March 15, 1917, under immense pressure from generals and politicians, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. For the first time in over 300 years, the Romanov dynasty no longer ruled Russia. Nicholas reportedly told his aides, "I am ready to abdicate. I will do it for the sake of Russia. May God help her." But God did not intervene. The monarchy was gone. The imprisonment and execution, the provisional government placed Nicholas and his family under house arrest. Later, when the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the Romanovs were moved from palace to palace, finally ending up in the city of Yekaterinburg. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, the family Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and loyal servants were led into a basement under the pretense of being relocated. The room was left a blood-soaked chamber of death. With that, the Romanov dynasty, once rulers of the largest empire on earth, was extinguished. The legacy of Nicholas II. Nicholas II is remembered as a tragic figure, well-meaning but weak, devoted to his family but blind to his people's suffering. His reign saw the disastrous Russo-Japanese War, the humiliation of Bloody Sunday, the rise of Rasputin and scandals at court, the catastrophe of World War I, the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. History has judged him not as a villain, but as a man out of his depth, an emperor born into an autocracy that no longer fit the modern age. The fall of Nicholas II was not just the end of one man's reign, it was the death knell of an entire dynasty. For over 3 centuries, the Romanovs had ruled with iron and splendor, but by clinging to absolute power, refusing reform, and mismanaging crises, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. In July 1918, the House of Romanov ended in gunfire and silence, yet their story of power, intrigue, glory, and downfall remains one of history's most haunting examples of the fragility of monarchy in the face of revolution. By the late 19th century, the cracks in the Romanov dynasty were becoming impossible to ignore. For centuries, the Tsars had ruled with near-absolute power, supported by the Russian Orthodox Church and a rigid aristocracy. But the empire they commanded was no longer the same feudal kingdom that Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great had known. Russia was slowly industrializing, and with industrialization came new challenges: overcrowded cities, unsafe working conditions, and a restless population that began to question why so few held so much. The seeds of dissent factories in Moscow and St. Petersburg churned with thousands of workers, many former peasants who had left the countryside in search of a better life. Instead, they found themselves laboring for long hours in unsafe conditions, earning meager wages while the aristocracy and monarchy continued to live in unimaginable luxury. Revolutionary ideas imported from Europe began to take root. Karl Marx's writings spread quietly through underground networks, whispering of equality, workers' rights, and the overthrow of oppressive systems. The Romanovs, however, largely ignored these growing tensions. Tsar Alexander III, who ruled from 1881 to 1894, doubled down on autocracy. He crushed dissent, censored the press, and expanded the secret police. While this brought temporary stability, it also pushed discontent further underground, where it festered like a wound. Nicholas II, the last Tsar. When Alexander III died in 1894, his son Nicholas II inherited the throne. Nicholas was deeply unprepared for leadership. Gentle, religious, and devoted to his family, he lacked the political strength of his predecessors. He once confessed, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one." Yet fate placed him at the helm of a nation on the verge of upheaval. Nicholas's reign would prove disastrous. He clung stubbornly to the idea of divine right, believing that God had chosen him to rule. He resisted political reform, ignored calls for modernization, and relied heavily on advisors who often misled him. Meanwhile, the problems facing Russia only grew worse. Poverty, inequality, and hunger plagued millions. A royal marriage with destiny. Nicholas's marriage to Alexandra, a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria, added fuel to the fire. Alexandra was deeply mistrusted by many Russians because of her foreign roots. Even more damaging was her reliance on mysticism, which would later lead her to place immense trust in a controversial figure, Grigory Rasputin. But at the dawn of their marriage, Nicholas and Alexandra were simply 2 young royals in love, blissfully unaware of the storm that lay ahead. The Russo-Japanese War, a humiliating defeat in 1904, Nicholas II made a fateful decision that further eroded his legitimacy. He plunged Russia into war with Japan over control of territories in East Asia. The Russian Empire, long considered one of the great powers of Europe, expected an easy victory over what they viewed as a lesser nation. Instead, Japan shocked the world by decisively defeating Russia, sinking its navy and humiliating its armies. The defeat shattered public confidence in the Tsar. For the first time, many Russians began to openly question whether their ruler was fit to lead. The Revolution of 1905 discontent boiled over in January 1905, when thousands of peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar for better working conditions, fair wages, and political representation. They carried icons of the Tsar, still believing he would hear their cries. Instead, soldiers opened fire on the crowd. Hundreds were killed in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacre sparked nationwide strikes, uprisings, and violent clashes. Railways shut down, factories halted production, and peasants attacked the estates of landowners. For the first time, revolution seemed possible. Under immense pressure, Nicholas II reluctantly agreed to reforms. He created a Duma, a legislative assembly meant to give Russians a voice in government, but the Tsar had no intention of sharing power. Whenever the Duma opposed him, he dissolved it. The gesture, intended to calm unrest, only deepened resentment. A temporary calm by 1907, the fires of revolution had been beaten back, but they had not been extinguished. Russia limped forward, but beneath the surface, the empire was fragile. Every defeat, every injustice, every refusal of reform added fuel to a growing movement that would one day engulf the Romanovs entirely. Nicholas II, blinded by faith in autocracy, believed he had weathered the storm. In reality, he had only postponed the inevitable. By the early 20th century, the Romanov dynasty stood on the edge of collapse. The empire was vast, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, but beneath its surface, cracks spread like fractures in ice. The failed revolution of 1905 had already shaken Nicholas II's throne, forcing him to concede reforms he resented. The Tsar still clung to his vision of divine autocracy, but his people were restless, his army battered, and his court increasingly divided. Into this volatile mix entered a figure who would become one of the most infamous characters in Russian history, Grigory Rasputin. The rise of the mad monk Rasputin was a peasant from Siberia who claimed mystical healing powers and an unshakable connection to God. Rumors of his abilities reached the Romanovs after the birth of their only son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The disease was a death sentence in an age without modern medicine. Small injuries could leave the boy bleeding uncontrollably, and doctors had no cure. Desperate for a miracle, Tsarina Alexandra invited Rasputin into the royal circle. To her astonishment, the monk seemed to calm Alexei's bleeding during crises. Whether by hypnosis, prayer, or sheer coincidence, Rasputin convinced Alexandra he was sent by God to save her son. From that moment, her faith in him became unshakable. But outside the palace walls, Rasputin's presence was a scandal. He was accused of drinking heavily, seducing women, and exploiting his influence for favors. Pamphlets depicted him as a devil in a cassock, corrupting the empress and poisoning the monarchy. The more Alexandra defended him, the more the Russian public turned against her, and by extension, against Nicholas II's blind loyalty. Nicholas II had always been more devoted to his family than to politics. He adored Alexandra, and his love for her blinded him to the dangers Rasputin posed. When ministers and relatives warned of the monk's corruption, Nicholas dismissed their concerns. To him, Rasputin was simply a holy man helping his fragile son. But this loyalty isolated Nicholas further from his people. By the 1910s, the Romanov court seemed detached, secretive, and out of touch. The aristocracy whispered that the empire was being run not by the Tsar but by his German-born wife and her sinister peasant advisor. In a country already rife with xenophobia and revolutionary agitation, this was political dynamite. The shadow of World War I in 1914. As Europe stumbled into the catastrophe of World War I, Nicholas made one of the most disastrous decisions of his reign. Bowing to nationalist fervor and alliances, he led Russia into war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At first, patriotic crowds cheered in the streets of St. Petersburg, but the enthusiasm faded quickly. Russia was woefully unprepared for modern war. Soldiers were sent to the front lines without rifles, sometimes told to wait until a comrade was killed to take their weapon. Ammunition shortages plagued the army. Railways failed to deliver supplies. Millions of peasants were conscripted, leaving villages abandoned and agriculture crippled. By 1915, Russian casualties were catastrophic. More than 2 million dead, wounded, or missing. Morale collapsed. Desertion spread through the ranks. Back home, food shortages turned cities into tinderboxes of unrest. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and families starved while the nobility lived in luxury. The people blamed Nicholas. A fatal gamble. Nicholas takes command in 1915. Nicholas made a fateful mistake. Believing he could rally his army by leading it personally, he left Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, to take command of the Russian forces. But Nicholas had no military genius. and his presence at the front achieved little. Instead, it left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs with Rasputin as her chief advisor. This decision was a gift to his enemies. That Tsarina, already unpopular for her German heritage, became the face of government incompetence. Ministers were appointed and dismissed at Rasputin's whim. Corruption flourished, and rumors of treachery spread. To many Russians, it appeared their country was being run by a foreign woman under the spell of a mad monk. Nicholas's absence also created a political vacuum. With the Tsar away, the Duma, Russia's parliament, demanded greater authority. Nicholas refused. His stubbornness only deepened the divide between crown and people. The murder of Rasputin by 1916, even members of the Romanov family recognized that Rasputin's presence endangered the dynasty. A group of nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov, plotted his assassination. The legend of Rasputin's death has become almost mythic: poisoned wine, bullets, and finally drowning in the icy Neva River. Whether all the details are true or not, Rasputin's murder on December 30, 1916, was celebrated by many as the removal of a national curse. But killing Rasputin did not save the monarchy. By then, the damage was irreversible. The war dragged on, food riots spread, and revolutionary fervor burned hotter than ever. The February Revolution of 1917 and early 1917, bread riots erupted in Petrograd. Striking workers and starving families took to the streets, demanding food and an end to the war. The protests swelled into mass demonstrations. Soldiers ordered to suppress the crowds instead joined them, turning their rifles against the regime. Nicholas, isolated at military headquarters, underestimated the crisis until it was too late. By March, Petrograd was effectively out of government control. Politicians and generals begged Nicholas to abdicate to save the monarchy. At first, he considered passing the crown to his son Alexei, but Alexei's fragile health made this impossible. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. His brother, Grand Duke Michael, refused to accept the crown, leaving Russia without a monarch for the first time since 1613. The Romanov dynasty had fallen. Imprisonment and the end of autocracy. After his abdication, Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest. At first, they were kept in relative comfort at the Alexander Palace. But as the revolution radicalized and the Bolsheviks rose to power, their situation worsened. The dynasty that had once ruled 1/6 of the globe now found itself powerless, guarded by the very soldiers who once swore loyalty to the crown. Nicholas, Alessandra, and their children faced an uncertain future, one that would soon end in tragedy. History rarely offers closure. The Romanov dynasty, once the unshakable symbol of divine monarchy, did not simply end in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Their bloodline, their myth, and their shadow lingered far beyond that tragic July night in 1918. The empire may have crumbled, but the idea of the Romanovs never truly died. For decades after their execution, the Soviet Union tried to erase their memory, to cast them as relics of tyranny and decadence. Textbooks painted Nicholas II as a weak, indecisive ruler whose failure justified revolution. Churches were closed, portraits destroyed, and even their burial site remained a secret. Yet beneath the surface, fascination with the royal family only grew stronger. By the mid-20th century, whispers of survival began to circulate. Stories emerged of a Romanov child who had escaped, often claiming to be Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the Tsar. These legends captivated the public imagination. Countless imposters surfaced across Europe and America, each insisting they were the lost heir. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a mysterious woman found in Berlin who bore a striking resemblance to the Grand Duchess. For decades, her claims stirred debate, court cases, and endless speculation until DNA testing in the 1990s proved she was not a Romanov. But the myth of Anastasia, the princess who lived, became immortal through films, books, and folklore. While legends spread abroad, Russia itself went through unimaginable transformations. The Bolsheviks' revolution gave way to Stalin's iron rule, the horrors of World War II, and the immense cost of industrialization. Yet even as the Soviet Union achieved global power, the ghost of the monarchy never fully faded. In private homes, secret icons of the Tsar's family were venerated. For many Russians, Nicholas and Alexandra became symbols not of excess, but of lost faith, innocence, and divine order. The Cold War brought another layer of irony, as the USSR presented itself as the future of humanity. Western fascination with the Romanovs grew. Historians, writers, and filmmakers turned their downfall into an allegory of modern tragedy, a warning of how arrogance, isolation, and moral decay could destroy even the mightiest of empires. Then came 1991, the year the Soviet Union itself collapsed, and with it, history began to reopen its sealed doors. That same decade, excavation teams discovered the remains of the Romanov family in a shallow grave near Ukraine. Through forensic research and DNA analysis, scientists confirmed what had long been suspected: the Tsar, the Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters had indeed been executed there. Later discoveries unearthed the remains of the remaining 2 children for the first time in nearly a century. The story had physical proof, bones that bore witness to both the cruelty of revolution and the fragility of power. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanovs as passion-bearers, saints who faced death with humility and faith. Their images returned to churches, their names to prayers, and their story to the public conscience. Even the state, now led by former KGB officer Vladimir Putin, began to cautiously embrace them as part of Russia's spiritual heritage. Memorials were built, documentaries produced, and the Ipatiev House, once the site of their execution, became a sacred pilgrimage destination. But this revival was not just about religion or nostalgia. It was about identity. Post-Soviet Russia was searching for meaning amid chaos, and the Romanovs offered a mythic past to cling to. In a nation torn between its imperial and communist legacies, they represented continuity, a link to an older, purer Russia, before ideology divided the soul of the country. Yet, even as monuments rose and candles burned, deeper questions lingered. Could one truly sanctify a dynasty that presided over famine, oppression, and inequality? Was Nicholas II a martyr or merely a man out of his depth, destroyed by the tides of change? The debate continues to this day. The Romanov story is not simply a royal tragedy. It's a mirror reflecting the human condition. It reminds us how power, once absolute, can dissolve overnight. How faith can become both a shield and a blindfold. How history itself is shaped not by justice, but by who lives to tell it. Across the world, fascination with the family endures. Museums in St. Petersburg and Moscow display their letters, photographs, and the few possessions that survived revolution. Descendants of distant Romanov relatives still live quietly across Europe, occasionally attending commemorations. The family's personal diaries reveal a portrait far removed from propaganda. Nicholas, a father who adored his children. Alexandra, torn by illness and mysticism. And the children themselves, playful, loving, unaware of their impending fate. Their humanity, stripped away by politics, has slowly been restored. The Romanovs' legacy also raises another uncomfortable truth. Revolutions devour their ideals. The Bolsheviks killed a family to build a utopia, but that utopia became another empire of fear. The very system that condemned royal privilege created new elites of its own, bureaucrats, generals, and secret police with powers far greater than any czar could dream of. The wheel turned, but injustice remained. In the 21st century, the Romanovs live on, not as rulers but as symbols. To some, they represent the dangers of unchecked monarchy. To others, they embody lost spirituality and national pride. And to many more, they stand as a reminder that history is cyclical, that even the grandest empires eventually face their reckoning. In popular culture, their story refuses to die. From animated films and historical dramas to scholarly works and conspiracy theories, the Romanov narrative continues to evolve. Artists and writers reinterpret it for every generation, sometimes romanticizing, sometimes condemning, but always returning to that haunting image. A royal family, imprisoned by their own subjects, awaiting dawn in a cold basement. A century later, the echoes of gunfire in Yekaterinburg still resonate, not in sound, but in spirit, in every nation that confuses power with destiny, in every leader who believes themselves untouchable. The Romanovs' fall was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an age, the twilight of divine kingship, when rulers could claim heaven's mandate without answering to humanity. After them came ideologies, wars, dictatorships, democracies, but never again the unbroken illusion of sacred monarchy. And perhaps that's the Romanovs' greatest legacy, the realization that no power, no lineage, no empire stands above the laws of consequence. Their story, written in blood, faith, and silence, remains a cautionary tale whispered across time, because empires may fall, revolutions may fade, and history may rewrite itself, but the ghosts of the Romanovs still watch from the shadows of eternity.